Thank you very much, everybody, for joining this Department of Psychiatry and CPFT joint seminar. My name's Graham Murray from both of those affiliations, but I'm very pleased to welcome Steve Fleming from University College London, who is based in the Department of Experimental Psychology and the Functional Imaging Laboratory there. And he's going to speak to us on how local and global metacognition shape mental health. So thank you very much, Steve.
Great. Well, thanks very much for the invite. Thanks to Valerie and Graham for putting this together, and for Min for organising today's meeting. So yes, it's what I'm going to focus on today, as I was saying to Graham just before, is really some new work we've been doing looking at global aspects of metacognition. And there's some data towards the end of this talk that is the first time we're presenting this today. So just bear with me when we get to that stage if things are slightly more clunky than usual. So the kind of motivation behind our work is to really try and expand the remit of cognitive neuroscience to not just look at how we engage with the outside world. So many fruitful areas of research on decision-making, learning, perception have been studying how we learn about and build models of the outside world. But as humans, we don't only think and learn about the world, we also think and learn about ourselves. So we're, in a sense, we're also building models or forming beliefs about ourselves and then using that self-knowledge to guide behavior. So things like, did I make a mistake? Is my memory failing? Or even higher level beliefs such as, am I giving a good talk? Am I acting in a good way in my daily life? And in my lab, we study these kind of things under the umbrella of metacognition research, which refers to the capacity to reflect on and think about our own thoughts and behaviors. And we're interested in not only the basic science of metacognition, but also how that has functional consequences for things like decision-making, cognitive offloading, how we think about what the prefrontal cortex does, also for potential connections between metacognition and self-awareness or self-consciousness. But in today's talk, I'm going to focus on this link that we've become interested in more recently, which is the link between metacognition and mental health. So I'll start with a very brief definition of what metacognition is. So by cognition, very broadly, we mean some kind of internal process that transforms inputs into outputs, such as making a decision based on some stimulus or retrieving some kind of information from memory. And very broadly, by metacognition, we mean the ability to think about and reflect upon these other cognitive phenomena. So metacognition has a recursive aspect to it, and in a sense allows us to introspect about our mental states. Now, in psychology, this is a very old topic. In fact, you can actually think of the birth of experimental psychology as really being focused on the study of introspection. But these guys were hit with a relatively modern phenomena, which was a replication crisis. So a lot of these introspective judgments in the early experimental psych labs didn't replicate from person to person. And I think for this reason, introspectionism as a theme kind of fell out of favor in psychology for many years. And Wundt himself eventually disowned the introspective method, saying that we need to focus on more objective behaviors. And then obviously we had behaviorism come along and really pull the pendulum over to the side of the spectrum where we, in a sense, ignore what people are saying about their own mental states. And throughout the 20th century, this pendulum swung back and forth. And I now think we're in this kind of happy medium, this nice position to be in, where in metacognition research, we can take a skeptical introspectionist stance, where we don't ignore what people say about what's going on in their own minds, but we also don't treat it as gospel. We don't treat it as a tool for studying the mind. And instead, we're interested in modeling this connection between behavior. So our capacity for various skills and abilities in various domains, and what we think about how we're doing in those domains, our metacognitive judgments of our performance. So the key idea is to take these metacognitive judgments seriously. And in the lab, we can do this by studying what we call type 1 and type 2 decisions. So type 1 decisions are decisions about standard stimuli in psychology experiments, like saying whether a stimulus is a face or a house, or saying whether you remember something or not. And then type 2 decisions are, metacognitive decisions about those type 1 decisions, things like how confident am I, or did I make an error? And when we have lots of these decisions over time, we can then build up a picture of the statistical association between behavioral performance, whether you were objectively right or wrong on any given trial, and your metacognitive judgment about that performance. And intuitively, if you have high confidence when you're right and lower confidence when you're wrong, then we can ascribe to you a high degree of metacognitive sensitivity. And so when we have these data, we can extract out various summary statistics that refer to this metacognitive level of performance. And in particular, we've been focused on, in our research, on these two dissociable features of the data. So we can think of metacognitive sensitivity on the left-hand side here, these two different rows, as referring to the extent to which people can assign high confidence to correct judgments and low confidence to incorrect judgments. So the higher your metacognitive sensitivity, the more separated these distributions become. But that is theoretically and to a large extent empirically as well, independent of your metacognitive bias. So just generally, how confident are you in a particular domain, irrespective of these trial-to-trial fluctuations in confidence. And there's been various nice developments in the quantification of these summary statistics for measuring metacognition. So one of which that actually goes back many years is the application of signal detection theory to now quantify not your sensitivity to an external stimulus, but now the sensitivity of your confidence ratings to your own performance. And roughly speaking, we can build these ROC curves that effectively quantify the overlap between these confidence distributions. So if I have a big separation between my correct and incorrect confidence distributions, that's associated with a big area under the type 2 ROC, and that's what we call having good metacognitive sensitivity. And then there's more recently, in a more model-based framework, we can extract parameters of how good your confidence ratings are. Now, I won't go to all the details of these models for the sake of time, but what you can do is you can fit a model to the confidence data. Again, this is a model grounded in signal detection theory, and that will return you a parameter that we call meta D prime. And this is directly analogous to the D prime that we often measure in perception or memory experiments that refer to how sensitive you are, how good your task performance is. That's what we call type 1 sensitivity, or type 1 D prime. And then meta D prime is the same idea, but now applied to this higher level of how good is your confidence at tracking your actual performance. And that's what we call type 2 sensitivity, or meta D prime. And often people compute the ratio between these guys, so meta D prime over D prime, and that gives us a nice summary statistic, which we call metacognitive efficiency. So how good is your metacognition relative to a particular level of task performance? So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through how we can start to formalize the notion of metacognition. We can start to measure it in a lab with type 2 decisions, so how good our confidence is at tracking our performance, and we can start to derive these well-behaved summary statistics that we can, in a sense, give it a number for each person that we have come in and do our experiments. And what I want to do in today's talk is to tell you a bit about how we can leverage those measures of metacognition, and then explore links between performance, metacognition, and mental health in general population samples. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about how we can start building bridges between what we call local metacognitive judgments about individual decisions and global beliefs about things like, am I generally good at doing this kind of task? Do I have high skill in this particular domain? So we think those things are related, but only recently have we started to try and build models and measures of the link between local and global metacognition. So why should we be interested in the link between metacognition and mental health? Well, I think there are both theoretical and empirical grounds for why this link is potentially interesting. So first of all, I guess very broadly, disorders of mental health are, in one sense, introspectively or subjectively distressing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be distressing. And so one prominent source of these beliefs, and this has been talked about a lot in the psychotherapy literature, may well be metacognitive, such as believing we're performing poorly when we are doing well, or misinterpreting cognitive or emotional states. And it's an interesting question how we get from the kind of task-based measures I just talked about there to these more this more clinical view of metacognition. And this is something we're interested in. I'd be very interested to hear the thoughts of people here on this. And empirically, we know from quite a few studies now that these subjective assessments of cognitive performance that we can measure with metacognitive tasks do seem to map on to things that we might be interested in relation to mental health. So this is, I could have chosen many examples here, but this is one nice example from some early work by Tony David, who's now here at UCL. And what he studied here was looking at the cognitive function of veterans from the first Gulf War, and he asked people a simple metacognitive question. So he gave them an IQ test, and then so then he could measure their objective cognitive performance on this IQ test, but then also asked them to fill out this subjective cognitive failures question. So to what extent do they think their cognition is poor in everyday life? And we see this a lot. So often these metrics are not very well correlated. So people don't tend to have great insight into their objective performance. However, what predicted very well their subjective cognitive failures was their score on the Beck Depression Inventory. So people who were more depressed tended to think they were performing more poorly, even though that wasn't actually the case. So this is, in a sense, a direct mapping between a metacognitive belief and a marker of mental health. And then taken to more extremes, Tony and others have pointed out that deficits in metacognition may then underpin lack of insight or even anosognosia. So if you have this total decoupling between metacognition and objective performance, you might have no insight into, say, cognitive failure or markers of other markers of dysfunction or illness. So what we wanted to do as kind of dipping a toe into this question was to start exploring links between metacognition and mental health in a data-driven way in a general population sample. And this was work that was spearheaded by Tricia Sho, who was a RA, the first RA in my group, who's now went off to do a PhD with Claire Gillen in Dublin and now has come back as a postdoc at UCL. And Marion Rouault, who was a postdoc in my group, and she's now in Paris. And what we were interested in was very simply taking a simple task, the simplest task we could find to measure metacognition and relate it to self-reported symptomology in a large online data set. And the way this task worked is, like a lot of our tasks, we use perceptual judgments to try and precisely control how difficult the decisions that we're asking people to make are. So on every trial, they had to decide which of two boxes that were flashed quite briefly had more dots, and then simply rate their confidence on a sliding scale in that decision. And so from these data, we can both compute their objective performance on getting the dot question right, so that's their D prime, but also their features of their confidence ratings, both their metacognitive bias, are they generally over or underconfident, but also their metacognitive efficiency, their meta D prime. And we quantified the perceptual decision-making performance using both signal detection theory, but also drift diffusion modeling, and I'll show you a bit of that in a minute. And we had two different experiments here. So the first one used a variable stimulus strength, and that was helpful for the drift diffusion modeling. And the second one used a staircase procedure to try and ensure performance was matched across subjects. So the way this works is that if you're performing a bit poorly at the task, the computer makes it a bit easier. If you're performing well, the computer makes it a bit harder. So that can adjust the task difficulty so that everyone's performing the perceptual task on a similar level. And that then allows us to nicely isolate variation in how your confidence tracks your performance. So just looking at the experiment 1 data, so this is a sample of almost 500 subjects. This was all collected online over Amazon Mechanical Turk. And this was quite early days for doing online psychophysics. It's now really common, but the thing that we were really pleased with is that we got really nice psychometric function and response time data, even though this was being done over the web. So you see that you get a nice increase of the proportion of times that they're getting the answer correct, the dot decision correct as a function of the difficulty, and also people, as you might imagine, are faster for the easier trials. And this psychometric function and response time profile is nicely captured by a simple drift diffusion model. And you can see the model fits in these diamonds here. We also got sensible confidence data. So I'm plotting the distributions of confidence similar to those cartoon plots that I showed you earlier. So people tend to have higher confidence when they're correct and lower confidence when they're incorrect. So they show a degree of metacognitive sensitivity. We also then asked all the subjects in this experiment to fill out several standard questionnaires measuring depression, schizotypy, generalized anxiety, and so on. And despite this being a general population sample, we observed considerable individual variation in the different questionnaire measures. And the questionnaires were based on ones that Claire Gillen, our collaborator, had used before in her work. And the motivation for sticking with the same questionnaires was that we were then keen to adopt a transdiagnostic approach to identify symptom clusters that may be generalized across the different questionnaires. And so, as I'm sure many of you here know, this approach, the idea here is to, rather than take individual diagnostic questionnaires scores alone, we instead pull all the questionnaire data and look for transdiagnostic factors that perhaps track some more graded dimension in a lower dimensional space. And what we found was we replicated Claire's 3-factor solution to this questionnaire battery. So we identified 3 factors, and we gave them the same labels as in her earlier work, where we had 1 factor tracking anxious depression symptoms. So this factor loaded mostly on questions related to apathy and anxiety. Another factor which was more about compulsive behaviour. So this factor loaded mostly on questions about OCD and schizotypy. And a final factor which loaded almost entirely on social anxiety. And what we could then do is enter these factor scores for each individual into a multiple regression to predict both their decision-making performance. So that's the first order performance on the dot task. How good are you at making perceptual judgments? And also their metacognitive summary statistics. So both their confidence bias, but also their metacognitive sensitivity. And on the y-axis here, I'm plotting the regression coefficients for each of those 3 transdiagnostic dimensions. And first of all, what we found was that the symptom profile was unrelated to decision performance itself. So that's it's not the case that simply being more anxious or depressed makes you worse about making decisions about the dot patterns. What we did find, however, was strong and systematic effects, and this replicated over both the experiments in the paper, between confidence level and the first 2 transdiagnostic dimensions. So in particular, we have this opposite direction of effect on confidence bias. So people who were more anxious and depressed tended to be less confident about their dot performance, whereas people who had more compulsive behavior tended to be more confident about it. And we found the reverse for metacognitive sensitivity. So people who were more anxious and depressed, even though they were less confident, also tended to have slightly more insight. And this, we think, makes sense because that means they're slightly more aware of their errors than people who are more compulsive. I should also mention this is controlling for a number of demographic variables. But one thing we were interested in, having got this result, was perhaps the reason we don't see effects on decision-making performance is that maybe that's not a meaningful null result. Maybe it's just a null result because the decision performance is noisy and we're not modeling it correctly and so on. So what we wanted to do was take some of these other demographic variables, in particular age and IQ, that we know from other studies do relate to decision-making performance, and look at whether those would predict features of the first order performance and potentially metacognition as well. And so to do this, we took the parameters of our drift diffusion model fits and entered them into multiple regressions with age and IQ. And what you can see here is we do get strong and systematic differences between people of different age range, different IQ levels, just like as previously reported for similar studies using similar tasks. So people who are older tend to be less accurate, they tend to be slower, they have higher non-decision times and slower drift rates, whereas people with higher IQ scores tend to be more accurate and have stronger drift rates. What's interesting, however, is that none of our, first of all, the age and IQ did not predict metacognitive features, and we've seen that in many other studies. I'll talk a bit about that at the end of this talk. So metacognition and IQ tend to be somewhat separate, which perhaps makes sense in that, you know, you can think of metacognition as, in particular, being aware of doing stupid things. Like you can be aware of making errors on a variety of tasks, and actually your metacognition can be quite good when you are performing poorly, as long as you are aware of the facts. And we saw this here as well, that we didn't see strong relationships between metacognition and either age or IQ. But perhaps more interestingly, we also didn't see any relationships between the drift diffusion model parameters and the mental health questionnaire scores. And so I think this is a nice double dissociation here, where we get strong links between age and IQ and decision formation, but not mental health variables, and vice versa for metacognition. So just putting that result up again. And more recently, we've, together with Claire's group, we've summarized these data in the same way as similar data that they have got from a reinforcement learning task, where they do ask for confidence ratings as well. And what's quite interesting there is that they see a very similar pattern. So if you look on the right-hand side of this plot, these are the same 3 transdiagnostic dimensions regressed against confidence. And the top plot is our data that I've just shown you, and the bottom plot is their reinforcement learning data. So it seems to be some general feature about confidence rather than the particular task we are using. The other thing to point out is that if we hadn't done this transdiagnostic analysis, if we hadn't used the factor scores, we wouldn't have seen these equal and opposite effects on the anxious depression dimension and the compulsive behavior dimension. Because if you look at the regression with individual questionnaire scores, it's just all a bit of a mess, and it doesn't really replicate from study to study. So it's only when you apply this lower dimensional, when you project the data into this lower dimensional space, do you see these links to confidence emerge. Okay, so in the second part of the talk, I want to tell you about now bridging between these local confidence ratings about individual judgments to more global metacognitive beliefs about our skills and abilities. So we can think of metacognition as kind of spanning progressively more abstract or global levels. So what most of the field has been focusing on is this lowest level, and that's what I was just presenting to you there. So our metacognitive assessments of our performance on individual decisions, individual trials. So in an exam, you might think to yourself, I got that question correct. So that would be a local metacognitive judgment about your performance on that question. But then after the exam, you might go out of the exam hall and think, yeah, I did pretty well on that whole exam. So that would be a next level up of more global judgment about your performance on that task as a whole. And then you could go even higher than that. So you can think, well, generally, I'm the kind of person who has good memory or good performance in that domain. And that would be an even more global judgment. And we know very little about how or whether each of these levels speak to each other. So one way of starting to investigate that is to, in a sense, create tasks where we take individual trials and start chunking them together. So in your daily life, you could imagine kind of thinking about your performance in individual instances, but then naturally chunk them together as well. So I might think to myself, I played tennis okay in that lesson, but now I go to work and I get on Zoom and I do some data analysis and so on. And now I go home and I return to being a dad of small kids and do that kind of stuff. And I can kind of be thinking about how I'm doing or what I feel about what I'm doing in each of those little episodes, those instances, but I can also group them together, right? I can create more global estimates of how I feel about my performance in these different areas of my life. And that's what we tried to do in these tasks that I'll tell you about now. So we tried to kind of formalize that intuition that we have these different levels of metacognition. So this was work that was led by Marion Rouault. And what Marion did was take our kind of standard local metacognition task and now create situations where people were performing these little mini blocks. So they had to take, they got cued as to the fact that they're now doing the blue task, for instance. And this would repeat for between 2 and 10 trials. And after that, they would switch to a different task, which was cued with a different color. And again, that would repeat for between 2 and 10 trials. And then after these mini blocks, they would be asked for this global self-performance estimate. So which task do you think overall you did better on? And we operationalized this in 2 ways. The first way was asking them for a forced choice decision. Which task would you like us to use to give you a bonus reward? So which task would you like to be rewarded on? And the other way we did it was simply using rating scales. So rate how good you thought your performance was on the blue task and on the yellow task. Now, in practice, the tasks were actually the same in that they had the same stimuli, and we could then manipulate the properties of those stimuli, but subjects were encouraged to treat them as distinct because of they knew that these global estimates were coming up at the end of each mini block. And the other manipulation we introduced here was whether or not they got feedback. So usually in local metacognition experiments, we don't give feedback at all because we're interested in people's confidence estimates in those individual decisions. But here we did give them feedback on a subset of trials, or we gave them no feedback at all. And the first thing to look at is, and sorry, the other thing I should have said here is that some of the tasks were easier than others, objectively easier, because the dot difference was bigger. So we had this 2x2 design in this first experiment where some of the tasks were easy, some were difficult, and some had feedback and some didn't have feedback. And we could then ask, how do these conditions affect both your objective task performance, but also your global self-performance estimates of each task that you're doing? So first of all, what we found was that there was a nice main effect of difficulty. So as expected, people performed better on the easier task than the more difficult task, and that this did not differ according to whether they got feedback or not. And that's fairly standard for perceptual decision-making experiments where people are well trained on the task. There's nothing extra to learn once you've understood what your task is. What is interesting though, and unexpected in this first experiment, but we've replicated this a number of times now, is that you get a big main effect of, you get 2 main effects on global self-performance estimates. So people think that they are performing better when the task is objectively easier, and they are right about that. But they also think they're performing better when the task has given them feedback, and they're wrong about that. So just the presence of feedback, doesn't matter if that feedback tends to also tell you that you're doing it bad, you actually think that's a good thing. You think, okay, generally, I did a bit better on the task where I got some kind of information, some kind of feedback. And we see that both in the task choices, but also in the ability rating. Now, so this is another way of saying that results. So people tend to underestimate their global abilities in the absence of feedback. Now, another thing that Marion did in this study was also then change the design. This was in a second experiment. So now, on some trials, we asked them their local confidence as well, and instead of just giving them no feedback at all. And so now we can ask, how does your confidence on each individual trial of the local task influence your global self-performance estimates? And interestingly, when we regress the confidence on every trial here, actually the difference in confidence between the task you choose and the task you reject, we find that that is a really good predictor of whether you tend to choose the task or not, even when you also control for differences in accuracy and differences in response time. So after you enter the confidence, these guys actually have no more contribution to make to predicting task choice. So what that tells us, or hints at, it's not a causal demonstration, it's a correlation, But what this hints at is that people might be building up these global self-performance estimates from local confidence fluctuations. And in the paper, I won't have time to go into it here, in the supplement of the paper, we develop a computational model that might explain why the feedback condition is producing these big main effects on task choice as well, because by definition in the feedback condition, you are getting a really strong confidence signal. You're either told you're definitely right or definitely wrong. So if people are building up these self-performance estimates from confidence-related information, then perhaps that can also explain this main effect of feedback. And we were then also interested in asking, how do these putative different levels of confidence formation relate to brain responses that we have been interested in for a long time in the prefrontal cortex, that we know from other studies seem to map onto metacognitive estimates. And so to address this question, Marion adapted the task slightly for use in the scanner. So now we only have the task choices, and now in the learning blocks, they're all 12 trials long. So you alternate between trials of the blue task or the pink task, and then at the end of each mini block, you're asked which task you want to choose. And what we can then do is sort the trials in the task in that mini block according to whether they were associated with the higher global SPE, so the task you chose, the task you thought you did better at, or with the lower global SPE. So we can do this in analysis because at the end of each mini block, we know which tasks the subject thought they were doing better on. And when we look at the behavior, again, we see this, there wasn't the feedback manipulation here, so we only have the difficulty manipulation, but we validate the fact that people are treating these task choices sensibly because they are choosing the easier task over the difficult task at the end of each mini block. And what we also did, because we didn't have explicit confidence ratings in the scanner, what we did is for each subject, once they got out of the scanner, they carried out a standard local metacognition task where they rated their confidence in every single decision about the dots. And from that, we could build a computational model of what their confidence should be on each trial within the scanner, and then fit this model to the accuracy and response time data that we got from the scanning trials. And what we can, to validate that model, what we found was that people's inferred or predicted confidence was indeed higher on the choices where they chose that task at the end of the block. So the higher global self-performance estimates, the tasks that were held with higher global self-performance estimates, or were also the ones where our model inferred that they had higher confidence on individual trials. So what we could then do is ask, in the network of medial, prefrontal and parietal brain regions that we have seen in previous studies to track confidence in individual decisions, how are the responses in this network modulated by this more global level of metacognitive evaluation? And so what we first did was select regions of interest that showed overall in the experiment parametric effects of this model-derived confidence signal. So the activations here in the BMPFC and the prekinesis positively correlate with confidence, and the activations in the dorsal anterior cingulate negatively correlate with local confidence. And this is, we've seen this in many studies. And what we can then ask is, how does this interact with whether that trial was one that you would assign a higher global SPE to or a lower global SPE to? And what we found is that if you just look on the right-hand side for a start, the null result, in the dorsal anterior cingulate, it didn't matter what your global estimate was. It was almost as if this brain region only cared about your confidence in that individual decision, and it didn't care about whether that trial was assigned to be a higher or lower global, as a higher or lower global rating. In contrast, in the VMPFC, most prominently, but also in the prekinesis, we saw that the coding of local confidence was modulated by the global self-performance estimate. And somewhat surprisingly, and we didn't expect this, it was actually more strongly coded on the trials with the lower global SPE. And we didn't, as I said, we didn't expect this direction of asymmetry. And our post hoc interpretation of this, our tentative interpretation, is we interpret this as, in a sense, a prediction error-like response on self-performance estimates. So if you think that you're performing the task fine, so that's the higher global SPE in yellow, then perhaps you don't need to be sensitive to local fluctuations anymore. It's almost you've made your mind up about that task. But if you think that the task you're currently doing is the one you're bad at, and then you get a local signal that tells you actually you're really good at it now, then that's an important piece of information. And that's perhaps why we see this interaction effect in the direction that it goes in, that this brain area is coding the local confidence more prominently on the task where I'm currently thinking that I'm performing worse. So that's the interaction analysis, which is slightly more complicated, but a simpler analysis we can then do is just a very simple main effect. If we contrast the trials on which you are thinking that you're performing better compares the trials where you think you're performing worse at a global level, so the trials where you go on to choose that task as your favorite task at the end of the mini block, what we see very clearly, and this is a whole brain image and this is an ROI analysis, that the tasks that are associated with a higher global self-performance estimate are associated with greater ventral striatal activity than tasks associated with a lower global self-performance estimate. And it's interesting that in previous work on local confidence, we haven't seen effects in ventral striatum, and you can see that here, that it doesn't seem to really care about variations in your confidence on individual trials, but it's only when you move to this more global level analysis that now we're getting these very strong ventral striatal responses. And we also see strong links between the extent to which you get a boost in ventral striatal activity, this baseline shift effect across individuals, and your global SPE sensitivity. And what we mean by this is, to what extent are your global self-performance estimates correctly identifying the objectively easier tasks. So this is kind of like a metric of metacognitive ability, but now at this global level rather than this local level. So people who, in a sense, activate their ventral striatum more in response to these baseline shifts are also the ones who tend to form more accurate global SPEs. So one way of starting to kind of integrate these results together is, in a sense, thinking of it as a hierarchical system where you might have some overall coding of the global self-performance estimate in the ventral striatum and associated regions, whereas in VMPFC there might be a more it might act more as a nexus of mapping local confidence signals onto global estimates. Now, there's still a lot of work to do to actually kind of investigate the consequences of those kind of interactions that we seem to be seeing in ventromedial prefrontal cortex for your global SPEs. These are all obviously correlational analyses. And I'll just end with a couple of kind of hot off the press results that I think are potentially interesting with in relation to mental health. So to the extent that we do have these different hierarchical levels, and I think our behavioral and brain imaging data suggests that we do, then perhaps what this means that there could be selective distortions in more global levels. And in recent work that Marion and Gert-Jan Will have led together with Ray Dolan, we've seen some evidence for this. So this was a study of 57 young adults who were selected from a community sample because they occupied either the bottom or the top 10% of reported self-esteem. And then what Marion and Gert-Jan did was gave them the same task that Marion had developed for looking at both local and global metacognition. And what they found is that there was no difference in performance on the task between the high and low self-esteem people, but there was this strong main effect of on global self-performance estimates. So we think that, in a sense, the self-esteem might be, you can almost think of self-esteem as a very, very, very global estimate, and that might be filtering down to how we think about our performance in individual tasks. And interestingly, this didn't interact with either feedback or the difficulty of the task. It was almost like a baseline shift. It's like, everything I'm doing here, I think I'm doing slightly better on in this low-level task. And also in relation to aging, so this is work by a PhD student in my group, Andrew McWilliams, who's also a child psychiatrist down at King's. And he was interested in developing a gamified version of these tasks that we could also then use across a wider range of ages into older adults. He's also now using these tasks with patients with dementia and also in children. And effectively, this is looking at both memory and perceptual metacognition in a gamified setting, using also staircase procedures to control task performance in a relatively narrow range, so that it makes it adaptively easier or more difficult depending on your how often you're getting the answers right or wrong. And this is just showing you some data stratified by, in a large online study where Andy collected 50 subjects in each of 6 age groups. And so he has over 350 subjects in the sample. And what we can see is that for basic task performance on the perceptual and memory task, we actually see a remarkable stability with age. So we don't see much evidence of first order cognitive decline in our healthy online sample. And also when we look at local metacognition, this is metacognitive sensitivity or efficiency on the y-axis here for the 2 tasks. Again, we don't see much effective age, if anything, in the perceptual task, because this is controlling for first order performance. We see a slight increase, although that's non-significant. But what we do see quite clearly in both domains, in both task domains, is that when we look at the global estimates, there's this negative correlation. So this would be, I think it's quite striking in relation to the other 2 non-results. So what this means is that people, as they get older in these data, are thinking on a global level they're not going to be as good at the task, but they're actually fine, and their local metacognition is actually fine. And so the more extremes of this range, we're interested in this, especially in relation to dementia and functional cognitive disorder, because the more extremes of this range might start giving us markers of subjective cognitive decline that can decouple from objective performance in interesting ways. So that's the last data point I want to show, just as a kind of graphical summary. We're interested in these links between local and global metacognitive evaluations. I won't talk through the summary because we're running out of time, but I will leave it. I will say one shameless plug. If you're interested in this stuff and want an easy read, I have a book out on metacognition, on various approaches to thinking about self-awareness, and that's out at the moment. And here's a sunny picture of my lab in non-COVID times, and hopefully we'll be getting back to doing these kind of things soon.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve.